Welcome, everyone, to Pollinator Palooza, our talk today on pollinators and the habitats they depend on. To get started today, we're going to begin with a brief review of Trees Forever, then a review of what exactly we're talking about when we reference pollinators. Next, why are pollinators even important? Then we'll bring in Sheila Weldon to the conversation to chat about honeybees specifically. Then we'll get into the heart of what pollinators need to survive and thrive. And finally, suggestions for attracting pollinators to your backyard. That's our agenda for this afternoon. Grab your popcorn and a cold drink, and let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit about a great organization I work for, Trees Forever. Our mission is to plant and care for trees and the environment by empowering people, building community, and promoting stewardship. Trees Forever was founded in 1989 and since then has planted more than 3 million trees. We do this with a staff of roughly 25 working in Iowa and Illinois. We have participated in national projects and are supported by individuals like you. First, we need to set the stage for what we mean when we talk about pollinators. It is crucial to understand that while we talk about pollinators in a general term, pollinators include many things. Most of us are familiar with bees and butterflies, but it also includes more mundane insects like flies and beetles and moths. And let's not forget about mammals like bats, bears, and yes, even humans. And even within insects, thousands of species comprise pollinators and have varying life cycles. Since we're talking about pollinators, I think it's worth remembering just what the act of pollination entails. Pollinators transfer pollen from the male part of a plant, the anthers, to the female part of a plant, the stigma, resulting in the production of seeds and fruit. So why are pollinators important? And why the concern over population declines the last decade or so? Well, the short answer is that pollinators are crucial to a healthy ecosystem and food supply. Pollinators are sometimes thought of as the canary in the coal mine and are a key indicator of ecosystem health. The reason is because 90% of wild plants need cross-pollination to survive and reproduce. When we put pollinators into the context to the overall food system, it is estimated that pollinators are responsible for roughly every third bite of food we eat. A few facts and figures regarding pollinators and the food supply. 84% of commercially grown crops insect pollinated. Pollinators affect over a third of global ag lands. And the last one, the vast majority of pollinators are wild or native. A few facts and figures regarding pollinators and their value to society. So between 235 and 577 billion worth of annual global food production relies on direct contribution of pollinators. When we factor in US wild pollination, it's estimated to be worth 10 billion annually. And then honeybee pollination alone is worth almost 20 billion annually. So we know that pollinators are important, but why are pollinators in danger? Many factors contribute to declining numbers of pollinators in general, but we know that numbers are declining. I love this photo because it shows very explicitly the importance of pollination. Now remember, insects and other pollinators do this work every day for free as part of their routine. So if they're not around to do this, someone has to. And before we giggle, that could be in the United States sometime soon if we continue down this path. So why exactly are we seeing these declines in pollinator numbers? Many factors play into population declines of pollinators. Certainly, loss of habitat and seasonal forage, exposure to pesticides and other chemicals, invasive pests and disease are a problem. And finally, a changing climate means changing landscapes. And some of these pollinators have very intimate relationships with specific plants. If we are to protect pollinators, we must know what they need and how to protect them. Basically, pollinators need four main things. They need access to forage for the entire growing season. They need access to nesting sites, protection from pesticides, and then protect undisturbed habitats so they have a place to make their homes. Well, let's start with year-long forage. Now, you remember I mentioned that when we talk about pollinators as a group, and we do this and kind of talk about them in general terms, but pollinators are comprised of thousands of different species of insects, mammals, birds, etc. Therefore, since we're trying to provide resources for all pollinators, diversity is absolutely crucial. Like in real estate, where the mantra is location, 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 the mantra with pollinators is diversity, diversity, diversity. A rule of thumb we like to suggest is including at least 3 species that bloom early, 3 that bloom during the middle of the growing season, and then 3 species that will bloom later in the fall. The reason for this is because some of these pollinator species will live their entire life cycle in the early part of the year, and some will not even emerge to start their life cycle until the middle or later parts of the year. Diversity ensures that we will have some sort of habitat for all species. Another good suggestion is to make, excuse me, another really good suggestion is to make the native seed mix heavy on the forbs and the flowers. Over time, the grasses can tend to take over. So boosting that initial level of forbs and flowers can help to overcome that. And finally, include a wide range of colors and heights. That's important as well. Sometimes we miss the forest for the trees. Pollinator habitat is much more than prairie. Perennials of all types can provide valuable habitat for forage or nesting. Next, we'll highlight a few of the trees and shrubs. Oaks are the quintessential wildlife plant. From mammals and birds to a vast diversity of insects, and then these insects become bird food. Experts believe that oak trees and forests support the most diverse flower populations outside of the jungle rainforests of the tropics. Many of these species evolved to live in the shade of oak trees. Black gum. Now, this is a dioecious. That means producing male and female flowers on separate trees. The female flowers are replaced by clusters of these kind of bluish black drupes. That's the fruit. Now, these are moderately long-lived. They get roughly 40 to 80 feet tall. They do prefer full sun to light shade. The deciduous leaves are quite colorful during the autumn. They become this golden yellow, even orange and scarlet colors, purple from time to time. And then you get these splotches of green, and then the dark drupes, the fruit that's still attached, can really make for a nice, pleasant aesthetic. Common names of this tree are also black gum, sour gum, and black tupelo. Serviceberry is native to Iowa, a great tree for bees. Serviceberry trees, also known as shadblow, sarvisberry, and shadbush. And then these trees and shrubs are members of the rose family. And I say trees and shrubs because you can get them as either form, more of a single stemmed variety and then the multi-stemmed shrub. Buttonbush. Now, buttonbush does well in wet areas and in the garden. It is a host plant to the Promethea moth, Hydrangea sphinx, and the saddleback caterpillar. Witch hazel. This can get up to 20 feet tall. Now, it's unique in that it's the last woody plant to bloom in the fall, and it blooms for about 3 weeks, which happens after its leaves have turned yellow and fallen off. And it attracts primarily wasps and flies. 9-bark. This is a multi-stemmed shrub, 3 to 9 feet tall. The bark of the lower stems is kind of a dark brown, maybe dull orange, eventually shredding into these kind of thin strips or sheets. The young stems often terminate in round clusters of flowers about 2 to 3 inches across. It blooms in late spring or early summer for about 2 to 3 weeks. Late in the summer, the flower clusters are replaced by these drooping greenish red fruits.
I'm joined now by Sheila Weldon with Hobbee Acres. Sheila has been teaching beekeeping to newbies interested in getting started with their own hives and has a wealth of knowledge about beekeeping in general and providing valuable habitat for honeybees and pollinators of all types. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you, Jeff. This is fun. I'm enjoying this, and it's kind of refreshing a lot of my beekeeping and pollinator information. So I'm enjoying this. Warning though, beekeepers sometimes start talking about bees, and we get a little carried away.
I'd like to jump right in. I just highlighted a couple of trees and shrubs that are great for pollinator habitat and an early season food source. I'm curious, what are your two favorite trees for pollinators?
Today, my favorite tree is the Japanese lilac because it's blooming, and my husband cut me a bouquet from that tree and brought it into the house, and my house just smells fantastic. Tomorrow, it probably won't be in bloom, and my favorite tree will be the lindens and the tulip trees. We have young tulip trees. I think we've got 3 out there, and this year we got some blooms from them. What I like about the tulip tree, it grows very large, very large. And what's sad is they're when they get really big, people cut them down. There was a gorgeous one, I think, over in Pella, and people, because it's so big, it makes them nervous that it's going to fall on their house at some time. So, and we live on acreage, so those were some trees that we wanted to plant. And it was kind of sweet to see a tree, because I'd heard that it take like 20 years actually before they start producing blooms, but ours, they've probably been in the ground, I don't know, maybe 15 years, I'm thinking. The linden, though, is actually my favorite, and we've planted some, and those are not producing blooms yet. And then the largest tree on our diameter of the trunk and everything is a linden tree, an American linden tree. There's a lot of reasons I like lindens. The linden tree is fragrant. I love planting plants and trees that have a fragrance. And like when I mentioned the Japanese lilac tree, what I like about it, like it's blooming now, but it smells like springtime when the lilacs are blooming. But the linden trees, their blooms hang down. So if you have a lot of rain, frequent rains, it's not as apt to wash out the nectar. That's one of the problems when we have frequent rains, because different plants, different trees, it takes them a while to recover their nectar. Some plants or trees, it's like once the nectar's gone, it's gone. It's not there again. And there's a lot of different varieties of lindens, and they each have their own little reasons why people like them. You know, most people are not planting American lindens on their property because, again, it's a large tree. They don't want it to fall on their house. But there's so many. Pella has a lot of linden trees that they've used for landscaping over there. And a lot of the trees will be fragrant. When I talk about trees for honeybees or other pollinators, the most important thing I think to think about is that large trees, it's like having acres of blooms in the sky. You know, you plant a little patch of something here on the ground, some of your pollinators are going to do it. But for honeybees, their colonies are so large, they need a lot of resources. Now, the honeybee is not native to our country. The Europeans brought it over here, the European honeybee. But because of the way our food supply is, and especially with the large monocultures, we need our honeybees. You know, we need to get them work for us. And but anyway, so that's the advantage of having these really large trees that are just full of blooms, and they bloom at different times. And that's why I probably like the linden and the tulip tree, because of their size.
Tell me, how is honey made?
Okay, the honey comes from the nectar that the bees are gathering. Now, the bees basically send out scout. Scout goes out and finds, I always called it their gold mine, because they're looking for that big, normally they're looking for a big tree that's got a lot of blooms that they can get a lot of nectar from. And they go out there, the bee finds, the scout comes back, does the little dance, and next thing you know, that tree is just a buzz with honeybees gathering nectar. We have out here at our house, we have like a cherry tree, ornamental cherry tree, and it's just loaded with blooms in the spring. And I went out there earlier on the deck, and I could just hear all these bees, and there wasn't any wind. It was just really neat to hear all that activity in that tree. And so they gather that, they take it back to their hive, and usually they are gathering it, especially in the spring. They are gathering all of that nectar so they can mix it with the pollen and then feed the developing larva. And then, so most of the food is immediately going into that. And then I guess you'd say the leftover honey, because they need to collect a lot of honey to get them through the winter and the rest of the summer. So they're collecting throughout the summer. In fact, a honeybee, the last job of their life, their little short-lived life, is a forager, and they basically work themselves to death. Their wings get real ratty, and when they die outside the hive. But they gather all of that, and then they dry it down, and they consume it and feed those resources to the young, and they consume it themselves throughout the winter. If we steal too much honey from them, and that's what we're doing, when we harvest honey, we're stealing the honey from the bees. Sadly, it's almost a standard practice sometimes to remove a lot of honey from the bees, and the beekeepers have to feed the honey. Or not feed honey, they have to feed the bees, but they feed them high fructose corn syrup. Now, we really don't like to do that. We never really did do that. And we were always very cautious not to harvest too much from them. But that is a real common practice, and especially in commercial beekeeping, is to take as much honey as you can and then feed the bees back sugar water or high fructose corn syrup. So who knew that people were feeding their bees, right?
You mentioned nectar flow, and I'd like to pick up on that. Could you talk to me about nectar flow?
Different plants produce nectar at different times. Trees, they'll have their nectar flow. They need the nectar because the bees are in the spring, they're very busy collecting pollen. Our maple trees, for example, I wish I had recorded this one earlier this year, because we have a maple tree outside our yard, and it was just, you could hear the buzz of the bees in this maple tree. Well, there's no nectar there, but maples produce a lot of pollen. And so the bees, especially in the spring, they're building up their population, and they're getting the pollen, and they're taking the pollen back to their hive. They'll mix it with some of the nectar or the honey in the hive and their own body secretions, and they'll mix that, and that's what they feed their babies, that developing larva that's growing inside the hive. So and the pollen is one of the most nutrient dense proteins that we or the insects can consume. It's microscopic. We really can't see the pollen, but the bees, they have that hair and fuzzy stuff all over their body. So when they're flying around, they're gathering up that pollen on their body, and then they kind of pack it into little cluster balls on each, like a load. They'll have a load on each side of their body, these nice round balls of pollen, and they bring that back to the hive. And that's what they're doing with the pollen. And then, of course, they're mixing the nectar, and they have to dry that nectar down because nectar is very runny. And as hive progresses in the season, they dry that nectar down to where it needs to be at least less than 19% moisture. If it's higher than that, the honey will ferment and turn into mead. That's how mead is. It's basically nectar or honey that's got too much moisture in it. And that's how people, I have never made mead. I have tasted it, never made it.
Wow, great information. Sheila, I heard a term a while back that I wasn't familiar with. Floral fidelity. What is that? Can you educate me on the topic?
Well, people often plant plants or even trees for the honeybees. And then they make a comment, they say, I never see bees on my plants. They never see the honeybees. Well, usually, like I've mentioned, the bees are seeking that gold mine. And so they find that gold mine. All the bees go to the gold mine and they work that gold mine till it's dry. So usually, like, one day, that's what they're doing. They're working that gold mine. And for example, almonds. Now, that's the floral fidelity is why we like our honeybees. It is the only insect that we really manage and that we need um, for our food supply, and especially with all the monocultures. The best monoculture and where the money is on bees is sending our beehives to, no, we never did send ours, but people send their beehives to California. They go over there on semi-loads and they put these pallets down that have about 4 hives on them, and they have them in the almond orchards. And what's really strange is they're there to pollinate. All those bees have been transported because they are going to work those hives. Well, what's sad is they have to feed the bees to do that because there's no nectar there in those almonds. Most of the time, it's very rare that there would be any nectar. So they're just there to pollinate and move the pollen around and take it back to the hive. So they have to feed them when they're doing that. There's no other insect that we can work like that and that will do that kind of a job for us because you need so many of them. And that's why they're like, well, migratory beekeepers. The bees are migratory. They're going up crisscrossing all across the country, pollinating services. And if we don't have our honeybees for the food supply, especially a lot of the foods that we enjoy eating, but there are people actually working on robots, little robots to do this work because they think down the road we're not going to have our honeybees. Imagine that world.
Well, folks, I guess it's true. You'll learn something new every day. And that is precisely why we bring you these webinars and knowledgeable experts like Sheila, who've done it and can share their experiences. Sheila, thank you so much. We're going to see you real soon during questions and answers.
Shifting back to some great species for pollinators. Here are a few grasses that are great, and then some of my favorite forbs that are also great habitat for pollinators. Grasses like Side-Oats grama provide valuable nesting habitat for ground nesting pollinators that require undisturbed areas for the labyrinth of tunnels and chambers they use to lay their eggs. Prairie dropseed. This is one of my favorites. It looks nice as a bunch grass, kind of growing in attractive clumps, but it also smells like buttered popcorn when you cut it in the summer. Little blue stem. The foliage provides food for caterpillars for a variety of the skippers, really common in our prairies and here in Iowa. Now to get into some of the colorful forbs, golden alexanders are attractive to many kinds of insects looking to get pollen and nectar, especially short-tongued bees, wasps, flies, and beetles. The plant is capable of self-pollination if no pollinators are present. Now, some folks confuse golden Alexander with wild parsnip, which is this weedy biennial that is taller, and it blooms later in the year and has more leaflets on each compound leaf. But for golden Alexanders, the caterpillars of the black swallowtail and Ozark swallowtail feed on the leaves and flowers, and the mining bee, that's a specialist of golden Alexanders. Oh, wow, yes, the showiest of all the milkweeds due to its color and the long summer bloom time, butterfly milkweed. Monarch caterpillars do eat the leaves, like the common milkweed. It is the host plant to the monarch butterfly, queen butterfly, and the milkweed tussock moth. The foliage lacks that toxic, milky kind of latex that typically oozes from the other milkweeds. And then other names. It's also known as pleurisy root for its medicinal purposes in treating pleurisy. Basically, people ate the bitter tasting roots as a remedy. Oh, wow, another just phenomenal colored species here. This is Liatris blazing star, stunning prairie flower. It blooms toward the end of summer, early autumn, providing some excellent forage during a crucial time of the year, late in the season. Speaking of late in the season, New England aster. Now, male bees are a common visitor. They feed on the nectar while waiting to mate with the females. Kind of what Sheila said with hanging out at the bar. They must be hanging out on the aster plants. New England aster is a larval host plant for the pearl crescent butterfly and the Canadian Sonia moth. It provides pollen and nectar to a variety of bees, flies, beetles, skippers, you name it. Okay, the next critical item for pollinators is access to nesting sites. So pollinators can be cavity nesters or ground nesters. Now, cavity nesters use these naturally occurring crevices or bore holes created by others to lay their young in these different chambers. The ground nesters use a system of tunnels and chambers to house their eggs and larvae. This is fascinating. Of our roughly 4,000 native bee species, 70% nest in the ground, and they only travel 200 to 300 yards. So this is why providing undisturbed areas is so crucial for pollinator habitat. These are interesting. Pollinator bee houses or hotels, sometimes they're referenced as. These are structures made up of these different natural materials that accommodate these solitary nesting bees and other pollinators by providing the cavities for them to live in and raise their young. So when building a bee house, use untreated lumber, certainly, and then make the holes in the wood roughly 6 to 8 inches deep using varying sizes because, of course, bees come in all sorts of different sizes. The bee house needs to have a roof with at least a 2-inch overhang protecting the holes and the hollow stems from the rain. The habitat house that's shown here is made of layers of pallets. And then in between the pallets are bricks, wood, kind of log pieces, flower pots containing all sorts of hollow plant stems and pine needles, pine cones, and other natural materials. This habitat is actually going to be used by insects and actually birds, amphibians, reptiles, and even mammals too. It's really hard to see, but on the dead branch in the upper right-hand corner of the house, there is a praying mantis. Fascinating. Okay, we need to be thinking about some common sense things to protect pollinators and other beneficial insects from pesticides and other chemicals. This may sound like preaching to the choir a little bit, but you all know this is true and it bears repeating. For those that don't know, the label is the law. Read it and abide by it. For example, often to avoid exposing insect pollinators to pesticides, timing of application is spelled out on the label relative to the blooming stage of the crop and other plants. Similarly, follow all pesticide label requirements regarding application conditions. Think of things like wind speed, wind direction, temperature, and relative humidity. They can all have an effect. Again, some common sense steps can go a long way to minimizing drift and undue exposure. Finally, we need to provide undisturbed habitat to provide overwintering habitats, nesting habitats, that is, and protect pollinators and other beneficial insects from pesticides and other chemicals. So undisturbed areas, absolutely vital for pollinator habitat. Dead trees, brush piles, tall grass, ground litter, all provide crucial homes for these little critters. For example, the queen rusty-patched bumblebee, which is a species of concern in Iowa, spends its winters hunkered down in about 3 centimeters of dirt under the duff layer in the woods. And this is enough, it insulates them enough to be nice and toasty during the harsh winter. Oh boy, I love this picture. One of my favorites. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So standing perennials provide the habitat pollinators need. Here is a leafcutter bee larvae, warm and toasty inside of a stem, waiting for the days to get longer and spring to arrive. So what can you do on your farm to attract pollinators? Well, it all begins with understanding right plant, right place. Know your piece of ground. Is it high and dry or low and moist? This will influence the species composition that will thrive in that particular area. What is the underlying soil type? And is the site in full sun or partial shade? To the extent you can, strive for local ecotype seed and plant a range of diverse plant sizes, from the large cup plant and compass plant to rattlesnake master and lead plant. Be an advocate for pollinators. Talk to your neighbors, friends, and family about the importance of native plants. Create corridors of plantings throughout your block or neighborhood. Talk to your local elected officials. Plant rain gardens or butterfly gardens throughout the community on public property, and just overall be involved. I really want to stress and thanks to our partners, the USDA, FS, Operation Pollinators, Syngenta. All of these made this presentation possible. With that, we'll get to questions and answers.